I think Jan is not. Oh, he is. Great. So, hello. This is a static site editor issue requirement session. And we are going to be talking about the research that we did on rich content editors alternative that we are evaluating to replace our current option, that is Toast UI. I'm gonna, besides that, and discussing the result of this research, we are gonna choose which are the editor alternatives that will be candidates to implement a proof of concept, where we are going to continue knowing and learning more about those editors to finally make the final decision of choosing the one that is going to replace our current alternative. Besides that, we are also going to define the proof of concept requirements that we want to, the features that we want to implement in the proof of concept. I'm going to share my screen now. So we focus on three editors. Each of the editors have a markdown parser as well. Usually these editors recommend a specific markdown parser because they have a data transformer that allows to convert the rich content that is produced by the editor into markdown. In the case of TipTap, that is just a wrapper around prose mirror. It uses markdown as well as prose mirrors, of course, because that's the markdown parser that prose mirror used to create the converter. In the case of CKator, the markdown parser is Mark. That is a markdown parser that is focused on performance. It is a very interesting characteristic. So where do we want to start? Do we want to do a quick overview of the results? What do you think? Okay. So in the previous issue refinement session, we talked a lot about prose mirror and TipTap. So here's first the alternative that I recommend to choose for us moving forward with the proof of concept are prose mirror and CKator, and here's why. So TipTap is a great alternative from the point of view that it provides a lot of out-of-the-box features, implemented features. For example, it has markdown shortcuts that when you type some markdown syntax, it will create that, it will format that text block. It has some tools to create tables and things like that. So it is enhancing. Yes?
Are you, I'm only seeing from column G over. Are you meaning to be talking about some of the left more columns right now? So not showing the screen share.
Yeah, it was not intentional. It was
okay.
just. So yeah, TipTap has these out-of-the-box features, but then from the point of view of maturity, from the point of view of the community, it has some disadvantages. For example, I don't see a lot of sponsorship from or usage from big organizations, and that's usually a good sign because it means that if the project has that kind of relationship, usually it is sponsored and it has a long-term maintenance contract with those companies. In the case of TipTap, at least I couldn't find that information or information from a third party. The sponsorship that it has in the GitHub sponsorship feature is very poor. They haven't reached a good level of sponsorship, economic, financial sponsorship as well. So far, the API seems very stable, but they are implementing a new version that apparently is going to be a big departure from the current API. In the case of the test suite, the test coverage is pretty much null. It doesn't have test coverage for most extensions. And here's something that is very interesting. So the way that they've been handling community extensions is that a community member submits an extension via pull request, but then this pull request doesn't contain test for the extension, and it doesn't have like this, these requirements, and then that extension ends up in the core package that the project owner has to maintain, and it's not maintained as an independent entity. So that usually put like more pressure on maintaining that extension in the project author, but then those extensions doesn't even have test coverage. And that's the case for most of the repository and the extensions that I saw. It doesn't have a release changelog, not in the same way that Prosmeter and CKAtor provide a very organized and a changelog with description of what every version has. In this case of Prosmeter, it has change logs for every core package. And in the case of the CKAtor, it's even, I would say that it's even better because they have an engineering blog as well where they explain what features they are implementing. In the case of Prosmeter and the CKAtor, the only concern that I found in the case of Prosmeter is that it is not a rich container per se with out-of-the-box features. It is a toolkit, like a framework that you can use to build a rich container. So that means that we are going to have to invest resources on building some of the features that CKAtor and TipTap already provides. Any questions regarding maturity or comments as well? Sounds like no long enough silence. So let's talk community now.
So from that perspective on the last one, is if we did use something that had a rich content editor already out of the box, would that mean that possibly we have less flexibility to make some changes to the UI if we wanted to?
Well, in the case of the three options, that's not the case. Although maybe I don't have enough information to give an accurate statement about that. But what I noticed is that even though in the case of CKAtor that has a lot of out-of-the-box features, they also have architecture that is extremely flexible. It is very, very similar to Prosmeter. They have this lightweight core, and then they implement everything that is related to the document state. For example, you know that in the case of Prosmeter, they have a document schema where they define what type of nodes within the document tree are valid. CKAtor is using the same architecture, the same document schema, and each part of the schema is not implemented within the core. The schema is extended by multiple plugins that are implemented as independent packages. So what I noticed about, in the case of TipTap, it is implemented in the same way. It has a lot of out-of-the-box features, but since it is based on PROSmeter, they follow the same architecture. All of the features that extend the schema are implemented as independent extensions.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, so community. The biggest difference that I noticed, well, in the case of usually the three projects have a high rate of response in the case of the issues. I noticed that the project maintainers are very active in answering and replying to all of the issues created by the community. In the case of the pull request as well, something that I noticed about CKAtor is that they are not receiving many pull requests from the community. They have first, CKAtor is a private company, besides being an open source project, just like GitLab. So they developed the project in GitHub. Most of the pull requests that are open in the repository are coming from employees of the CKAtor company. So that's a reason that I mark this one as a partially fulfilled evaluation criteria. I saw some pull requests from the wider community, and the response was quite quick as well. But I think that is something that is worth mentioning, because that's one of the problems that I saw with Toast UI, that they were having this private development process, and then they were releasing a new version, but I wasn't seeing a lot of contributions from the wider community. In the case of sponsorship, as I said before, TipTap doesn't have a lot of financial sponsorship. In the case of PROSmeter, it is continuously supported by New York Times and RStudio. And in the case of CKAtor, it is a for-profit company. So that's, that they are implementing this project for profit, even though it is open source. And then in the case of the if a project is open to shaping the direction based on community input, I saw that TipTap has a product roadmap issues, and issues to discuss the shape of the new version that they are planning to implement. In the case of PROSmeter, they have an RFC process. And I noticed that it is a very active process, and I've seen contributions from the wider community. But in the case of CKAtor, this is not the case. The product decisions are made in private. And in relation to community author plugins, first, TipTap, the way that, as I mentioned before, the way that TipTap extensions are managed is that the wider community is submitting pull requests to put the plugins within the core repository. In the case of PROSmeter, there are third-party plugins that are implemented as independent packages. And in the case of CKAtor, I think that this is another case of a project that most of the features are implemented in-house. Let me scroll back a little bit. So, any comments or questions?
If I recall, one of the big drawbacks of going straight with PROSmeter instead of TipTap was we'd have to put a lot of the plumbing in ourselves. And and that would require quite a bit of work. Now, I think we shouldn't discard how much effort goes into creating that wrapper over prose mirror, unless you're confident that what TipTap is actually providing is not that valuable and can be recreated with effort, obviously. But I think from previous conversations, it seemed quite that was, the abstraction or the layer over prose mirror that TipTap provides was valuable.
It is valuable, definitely. So I did a bit more into TipTap and to understand what exactly TipTap is. I think that TipTap provides three components that are very valuable. Well, two actually. The first one is the menus. So let me go and open the demo page of TipTap. So they provide these menus that I think that it will take time to implement that. It will take investing resources. I don't know how much, and that's the reason that I want to make a proof of concept with Prose Mirror that maybe includes some of these features. But I think that this has a lot of value. And the other component that is very valuable is a view interrupt layer. And what I mean by that is that when Prose Mirror, the Prose Mirror provides a way of implementing UI components to represent all of these blocks of content. So if you want, for example, to implement a hidden element that when you hover over it, it will tell you which level of hidden it is. Prose Mirror provide the means of doing that. But then what TipTap implements on top of it is that you can implement that UI component using Vue.
Okay, so there are some things about TipTap that are less than ideal, based on our assessment, but none that I see there would necessarily in and of itself be considered deal breakers, right?
I think that
Test coverage concerns me.
Yeah, okay, but what stops us from contributing test coverage?
Writing tests after the fact for untested code is very difficult and often impossible because it's tightly coupled and not cohesive. And doesn't seem to be a good use of our resources.
Yeah, and usually when writing tests usually drive the design and the way that you structure the code. So that means, as a result, if you are writing code that is not well tested, that also says a lot about the way that you are designing your code and your implementation.
Yeah,
That's
to me, the lack of tests, not only implies a lack of tests, it implies a lack of possibly a solid design in some areas, but even if it's usable.
Well, I think they've already answered that question in that issue where they talk about the rewrite of TipTap, and I think they probably recognize, some of the limitations and stuff. It's a pity they don't have it in a branch available already to be reviewed and stuff, so that one can see kind of like how it looks and how much different is it. And I mean, because
refer to their V2.
In the same breath, I've got concerns about CK editor, and it's the fact that they're a for-profit company, and means that there's continuous development, but it makes them also much less open to change and input and stuff. But on the other hand, you don't have the same issue as you have with TipTap, where the maintainers, or I don't know how many maintainers there are, but they could lose interest, move on to a new project. It's, I think from the assessment, it's clear there's no obvious winner. There's no obvious, hey, this is clear as day the best solution for us. All of them have drawbacks. I think from a pure technical point of view, Prosemirror and Markdown is probably the best options, but it comes with the overhead of us having to implement a lot of our own stuff.
Well, we are not done with the other columns, so there are other very interesting points that I think that are worth covering.
Okay, I'll get back into my box and allow you to carry on.
One thing I want to add to is specifically, Enrique, you were just talking about two specific, very useful pieces that TipTap provides. Again, if we were to, say we do go the Prosemirror Markdown route, theoretically, we would then be able to hopefully be able to get an estimate of how much time would it take to do the amount of UI layer that we actually would need, right? With test coverage and with, yeah, so I don't know. I'll let you continue, but that definitely jumps out.
Well, I think that that's a really good point, because we don't have all of the information, the necessary information to understand how difficult it is to implement that interrupt layer review by ourselves. Because I see those components are valuable, but I don't know how much they they actually are valuable. I don't know if it's gonna take us like months to actually implement that interrupt layer and those components, or if it is something that we actually can implement relatively quickly in-house. So that's the reason that I think that we need to implement the proof of concept to have a more accurate understanding of how valuable what TipTap provides is.
So one other thing, even if we go with TipTap and Markdown it, in the future, like worst case, they completely fail the rewrite or they do something bad with TipTap, we are still able to do something different on top of Prosemirror if we want to, which would be like the same place we're starting at. So like as a starting point, having, all of the functionality of TipTap, even if it's not perfect, seems to be a lot more out of the box.
That's an interesting point. Basically, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is like, and obviously Enrique has more points to hit, but like based off what we know right now, your position would basically be, we might as well use TipTap because we at least have a starting point, and we just have to be very careful with that implementation such that we don't keep things essentially loose enough that we don't get too tied into that, because otherwise we're starting at 5, which is Prosemirror and Markdown anyway. So we might as well leverage the work that's been done in TipTap, is what it sounds like. Is that accurate, or?
Right, and in what ways, what are the longer term risks of that? Like what does using TipTap lock us in? Like if we modify it or go down a different route that's less flexible?
Yes, what I found, what I don't know yet, because actually I don't know, is how much we are, if we adopt TipTap, how much we are coupled by the way that they structure their projects. I mean, how difficult it is to actually discard the TipTap layer and go back to Prosemirror in a future point.
Yeah, it seems like if it's since it's MIT license and it's on top of Prosemirror, unless they're actually modifying Prosemirror itself for having a forked version, it seems like it's always possible to fork TipTap and take it in the direction we want if in the future we get to a point where they're just doing things we can't live with.
As another thing too is we should, if we haven't already, just reach out to TipTap team and see, like, can we, assuming it's going to be MIT as well, like, can you show us V2? Like, can we, That might be worth checking out.
They said it was TypeScript, right? Which even without tests makes me a little bit more comfortable.
I agree.
Cool. So one aspect that I found very interesting is about the mobile support. Um, so none of the alternatives are broken on mobile. So they all work on mobile, at least in the web browsers that I tested. What I really appreciate about CKator is that it has some first-class mobile features. For example, if you are selecting a text segment, usually what CKator does something of like zooming into that segment of the UI and to display the context menu that is like related to that text segment. So that's something that I really liked, and I think that is like it made me realize that there is a difference between it is not broken on mobile, and it actually has like features that are implemented that are targeting mobile. Another aspect that I noticed is that um, things like, let's say that we have like a top menu, a top toolbar, and then we need to adapt that toolbar to hide some of the options because the form factor is too small. That's something that that neither TipTap or ProSmirror provides, because it should be like a responsive user interface, and that CKator actually provides. So that could be also a very important aspect to evaluate.
I feel like a lot of it's easy to put the, like our concerns, on paper, paper. Um, but I think we feel we should probably test out a lot of these. And that's obviously the next obvious logical step in our process is we want to create proof of concepts. We can test our open CK editor is to accepting a community contribution and stuff like that. Like a lot of these things might, their first class mobile support, we should not underestimate that value. Most editors, web editors out there, they kind of like, like they just ignore mobile. And it works if it works kind of thing. And getting stuff to work on mobile is no mean feat. Like it's not to be looked down on.
I agree.
Yeah.
That's worth a lot. First class mobile support.
Yeah, and again, as Jan is saying, I completely agree. I think that this is great. This evaluation criteria is great, but I think that implementing the proof of concept will add another layer of insight that will strengthen, our confidence to make this decision. I think I've been doing this. I've been filling this evaluation criteria, and I don't feel like, not near 100% confidence of making that decision. But I really like, finding these kind of things like, it looks great on mobile, and it actually has some, they care about implementing a good user experience in that form factor. In the case of teamability, either TipTap or ProSmirror have provide a user interface. So we don't need to implement a theme. We actually need to implement the user interface. And in the case of CKator, I recommend looking into this. They have some themes customizations, and also like a framework to implement a user interface and completely replace all of the visual components that they already provide. In relation to extensibility, um, in relation to extensibility, the three alternatives are very similar. TipTap, because it is based in Prose Mirror, but TipTap also provide within the layer that they build on top of Prose Mirror, they structure it to be very extensible. And we probably won't have any kind of problem with that. TipTap has a very good layer that allows us to access to the Prose Mirror state whenever we need it. So it's gonna be easy to implement something that we need to rely on Prose Mirror instead of TipTap. The only concern that I have with TipTap is that the documentation is not good. It is not very well documented. Um, and in the case of the text selection and cursor manipulation API, I need to dig a little bit more into that because they don't provide the API to do it, but Prose Mirror does. So we need to figure out how do we access Prose Mirror to handle the text selection and cursor manipulation. Um, in the case of CKAtor, they don't have a plugin ecosystem. Really, I think that it could be this kind of development model where we are fully relying on a single entity to implement what we need, and that's also very risky. That's unlike Prose Mirror. That Prose Mirror has a really a really good community. We have like TipTap implementing a layer on top of Prose Mirror that is great. We have also a React community that is implementing. I don't remember what is the name of the project, but it's also like really good. So that's the biggest concern with CKAtor and extensibility. Any remarks or comments?
In terms of the lack of a plugin ecosystem for CK Editor, I'm sorry if you already said that. I was focusing on something else, but I assume that their extensive feature set probably makes up for the lack of a plugin ecosystem of contributions by the community.
That's right. Like even though I don't see third party plugins, in npm, at least they have an architecture that allows to pretty much modify everything within the editor.
So the mobile support seems to be a big advantage. Like that's something that would be difficult or likely impossible to add like to TipTap. And I guess for writing our own thing on top of Prose Mirror, we'd have to ensure it all ourselves, which would still be a lot of work. So in terms of effort, that seems to be a big win for CK Editor. But in terms of risk, TipTap is a little bit more risky because lack of tests, a big rewrite coming up, no documentation.
I want to just throw in something to consider as well. There's a big consideration of using our editor for more than just a static site editor. So that would be, for instance, issue descriptions, comments, merge request descriptions. So everywhere where you can write Markdown currently, by allowing a rich text WYSIWYG editor experience for that. How heavy is CK editor compared to TipTap or Prose Mirror?
I don't know.
Is it that? Okay. Because like I can only I remember when CK editor was still FCK editor, and then it became CK editor, and it loaded a good chunk of JavaScript and stuff into with it, and so I'm going to make an assumption, considering they have first-party mobile support, that they probably have focused a lot on payload size as well over the years. So, but I do think that's something we want to, especially in the context of our performance work that we're doing. Like we don't just want to load another, 500K or whatever, into our page bundles just for the sake of it. So yeah, I think that's probably a data point that we didn't clearly enough define necessarily initially, but with the overall performance work going on, we should probably consider the performance impact that each editor might have as another data point.
Yeah, something else maybe worth considering on that note, Enrique, is like the instancing. So in the context of like a block editor, or for example, if this manifests in the, in the comments or something, like how many instances could you have open? Does that now start really being a problematic thing? Unlikely, but something to think about maybe.
That's a really good point.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. I think that we can make this research as part of the proof of concept implementation.
Enrique, I think one of the things you wanted to decide on was whether we eliminate one of these options before we move on to proof of concept phase. Are there more criteria you want to run through before we have that discussion?
Well, I want to skip the technology part because it is I don't think that it provides a lot of value to the discussion. But in terms of the UX pictures, one of the features that I think that we talk about a lot about we desire is the block-based editing. None of the editors provides that 100%. In the sense that usually what we aspire to is something like this, right? Something like the block-based editor in Notion, where you have reordering blocks and all of that. And none of the editors provide that. They provide some features like floating menus that can help us speed up the development process. In the case of TipTap and CK editor, so that's worth mentioning. In the case of Markdown shortcuts, TipTap already provides this picture. I think that this is where TipTap shows its strength, because it provides many of the features that we desire. It supports, in the case of CK, or they provide an API that will allow us to implement it quickly, but it doesn't fully provide the Markdown shortcuts feature. And then there are other, particularly Eric, that has been that created an issue to that collects everything that we wanted to fix in Toast UI. For example, editing existing links, that's something that TipTap already provides. That's also something that CK provides. It's going to be easy to implement in Prose Mirror. Pasting tables, that's something that the three options pasting tables from Google Docs, that's something that all the alternatives already support. And much of the bugs that we found in Toast UI, they do not exist in either archive. So yeah, that's the last criteria that I wanted to cover. So we can now decide we will be which of the editors we want to choose.
I have 2 comments. One with respect, and again, this is probably saying it's easier said than done, but with respect to none of the editors having block content support. In theory, this really maps well to my question previously about instances. If there's no issue with the instances, all it is like conceptually is just an array of those instances where each of those blocks is some small partial subset of markdown. You can rearrange them, and then at the end, you iterate all through all those and glue them back together into a file of content. Is like, again, conceptually, that's how I see that working. So I think that's something we can solve when we want to actually have a block editor. The main thing I want to say is, and again, I don't know if this is the right answer. My gut kind of says, again, there's trade-offs with all of them. CK Editor 5 seems to be the most strong and robust, and I think that's a result of having a dedicated, team that's working on it. Obviously, there are trade-offs there with kind of community flexibility there, right? So what I'm curious about is, regardless if it's that one or however we end up doing this, I'm kind of curious, what if we focus on just one solution and try to prove why it won't work or something? Like, so right now my gut is like CK5 editor, we go with that one and we say, why won't it work for the things we want to solve, assuming it's the strongest one we think. The next step would be prove why it doesn't work, as opposed to splitting our efforts on all of them. We at least start with what we think is the best and find what are the shortcomings still. And then we can maybe look at another solution and say, how might it fill the gaps for that? I don't know. That's just kind of what comes to mind at the moment.
I think that's a really good idea.
Another, my memory might be failing me. Was there a reason we didn't look into editor.js?
It looks great, but I think that, but something that I found that is very, very curious is that they do not support nested lists.
Yeah. All right. That's a deal breaker.
Yeah.
Okay. Man, I wish there was like a clear winner here.
I'm sort of feeling like because of the maturity and the fact that it's a commercial product, the mobile support, CK Editor seems like a strong choice. It doesn't seem like it's going away. And I think the payload size and the approach to instancing, I think, are two of the big questions that might put it off of the table. But as far as like you said, with not having a plugin ecosystem, it's a commercial product, and they have a lot of their own extensions, it seems, but for like word export, but things that we won't need. But it seems like it has to be extensible to allow those sorts of things anyway.
I want to make I'm gonna put on my cowboy hat and I'm gonna suggest we drop prose mirror and markdown it as an option. And I'm gonna suggest we leave it between TipTap and CK Editor. I think the work needed to create all of these utility on top of prose mirror, it's just too much for us to go and create ourselves. I think I like Derek's approach of, looking at each of the viable options, and if in this case it would be row 4 and 6, let's identify its weaknesses and let's go or our concerns, and let's try and prove our concerns wrong, or our assumptions, and let's prove it wrong. Because that might be a quick way to eliminate an option as well. We might feel that TipTap is just poorly written, bad code because there's no test coverage. What if we reach out to the developer, see if they're responsive, and what are they doing with the new rewrite? When are they willing to open it up to beta and stuff like that? maybe that helps us ease a lot of the pain or the perceived kind of like concerns we have with it. The same with CK editor, you know, like I remember it being heavy and bulky, but you know, like that's just an assumption that we need to go and check. And I think, you know, there's the multiple, like the context we need to remember that you know, we didn't specify initially what is that we want to be able to use this beyond just the static site editor. Now, if that means we can have a page editor light or rich editor light, great. Yeah, it doesn't have to enable all the features, because when you think of a comment box, it doesn't have to enable everything that the full static site editor might need. So yeah, but I would already move to eliminate prose mirror, pure prose mirror, and having to write our own layer on top of that. And I think we can probably, before we actually build a proof of concept, we can probably do a little bit more validation by trying to prove the opposite of what we're concerned about each of the other two options.
Yeah, I think that if we can manage, if we can handle TipTap as a way of speeding, you know, our development process, but at the same time we can make some assurance that we can drop it and actually rely on Pros Behavior, we are gonna be okay. But I have the same feeling that to reach the point where TipTap is gonna be very costly for us, and it's not a boring solution, to be honest.
I think the decision to drop 5 makes sense and maps back to Chad's earlier comment, which is kind of like a no-brainer, which is like looking back was an awesome comment, is TipTap is already building on top, and if we have to do that, we might as well start there. So I think that makes total sense to knock out the prose mirror markdown without the layer on top for now. I think that makes total sense.
So how do we, sorry, Chad, were you going to say something?
Sure, I was going to say, I also agree. It's down to between those two. And thinking about the not having a plugin ecosystem and a CK system, it seems like not that big of a deal if it's already feature robust. The fact that TipTap's not documented, doesn't have tests, I think that's a little bit of a factor. But aside from that, the two biggest immediate practical things I think are, is it going to really have first-class mobile support, which CK Editor seems to be the winner there. And like, is it going to break going forward, like, which is a risk for TipTap. But CK Editor seems to check all of the boxes. And then the other main thing I think is like the mobile support and the payload size. Both of those are things that just could be deal breakers, whereas the others are, you know, maybe we would have to work around, but it wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world as long as it still does what we want.
Yeah, I see the, in terms of one exercise is basically, say we pick these two or we just focus on one, whichever way we end up doing it, just for the immediate like experimentation, is mapping that very granularly against our issue of like, what was wrong with Toast UI? And like, how like, does it, maybe both of them solve all the problems? And then we have to obviously still go back to now maybe the mobile issue or like compare the other things. But again, like CK Editor could, again, have the lack of plugins, but then when we actually compare them to what our shortcomings were with Toast UI, if they're already fulfilled, that's awesome, right? Like, so that's, I think we need to get pretty granular here in short order, basically.
So what other requirements do you think that we have to include in the proof of concept? I created a new section with proof of concept requirements because I want to evaluate the payload size and the multiple instances concern within that work. So what else do we want? What is the best way of knowing if those editors are not the best option for us? How can we discover that through the proof of concept?
It seems like your UX section already does a pretty good job of comparing it to Toast UI, right? So other than the two you said, the payload size and the instancing, I'd like to see like more details on what is substandard about the mobile experience with TipTap compared to CK Editor, and is that something that we expect mattering to our users or not?
And I kind of just mentioned this a little bit, but I think looking at the actual issue that I believe Eric created, where we listed the specific things that Toast UI has a shortcoming on. One, you've actually already covered at least, if not more, with respect to cursor support, right? Being able to put the cursor wherever you want dynamically and have that be understood transferring from WYSIWYG to Markdown mode. That's one specific example. Whatever the other items are, that's what I'm most curious about, is like, do those still fall down, or are those solved? Those could be all solved, which would be awesome. So that's really what it comes down to, is like a lot of the UX subtle details is where that's basically where Toast UI fell down, and then also being able to kind of do the custom things we want, which again concerns me a little bit still with CK Editor, and that's where we have to dig in. Does it have all the things that solve? Because inevitable, you want to do something custom, right? So that still scares me a little bit with CK Editor. But again, if it's so full featured, maybe that goes away. I don't know.
So perhaps something that we could do is do something that I did with the Quill and Remark demo that was implementing an ERB visualizer, a template visualizer that will demonstrate that we can easily implement a custom UI component to display template syntax and recognize it within the Markdown parser, the JSON tokenizer.
I think that's a great example, because that was one of that's basically like the extreme hard thing, right? with respect to the editors, can we properly separate code snippets, templates from actual Markdown? Can we do that in a great way? Because that's a big deal for our code base, basically. And I think a lot of other code bases that, especially on the Jamstack, that want to now integrate, React style, dynamic templating and that kind of stuff. Like being able to do that and handle that first class is, I think it'd be a big deal for us moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Eric. Thank you. That's the one that I was overlooking, and it's the one that has been very difficult for us so far with Toast UI. I think that looks like good enough for a proof of concept. More than that, and I would be implementing the alternative already. Cool. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I think that now we have proof of concept requirements, and we choose to go ahead with TipTap and with CK. So thank you, everyone. I think that's it. Do you have other comments or questions?
I just want to say thank you for doing this. I know there's a lot of research, a lot of reading, and like trying to summarize it down into bite-sizable, comparable chunks. Took a lot of effort, and it's super valuable. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Very thorough.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, and thank you to Jan as well. That helps me to actually define this matrix. That was very helpful. That was actually the core and the most important part of the work. Okay, right. So thank you, everyone, and have a good day.